October 14th, 1943. 15,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. The air shook with thunder. Black flak bursts dotted the sky, and silver bombers flew straight into the storm. From the ground it looked like an endless highway of wings, stretching from horizon to horizon. But for the young American crews inside those B-17 flying fortresses, it was the loneliest road in the world. Inside one of the bombers, the crew chief glanced at his watch. They had been in German airspace for only 30 minutes. Already 2 fortresses from their squadron had vanished, falling in fireballs toward the earth. He didn't need to say it out loud. The mission was going bad. Up above, in the cockpit of a German Focke-Wulf 190, Oberleutnant Heinz Kocher grinned as he pushed his fighter into a dive. He had done this many times before. The Americans flew in their famous combat box, 3 layers of bombers stacked tight, each bristling with .50 caliber guns. On paper, those guns covered every angle. But Kocher and his comrades had found the blind spots, the weak nose, the hesitation of nervous gunners, the panic that set in when wave after wave of fighters attacked. Kocher's burst lasted just 2 seconds. The American bomber he aimed at erupted in smoke. Another kill for his logbook. For the Luftwaffe, this wasn't just war, it was routine. That morning, 2 91 B-17s had crossed into German skies. By sunset, 60 would never return. Another 17 would land so heavily damaged they'd never fly again. Over 600 airmen, sons, husbands, brothers, were killed or captured in one day. The Luftwaffe called it a turkey shoot. The Americans called it Black Thursday. One German ace later joked to his comrades, "These bombers are nothing but flying coffins. We only have to wait for them." And that was the truth in late 1943. American bombers could strike at the heart of Germany, but they could not escape the butcher's bill. What the Germans didn't know, what they couldn't imagine, was that this day, this so-called triumph, would be among their last. In just a few months, everything would change. The Americans were about to send a new kind of fighter into the skies, one that could go the distance, and when it arrived, the laughter would stop. If the skies over Schweinfurt looked like chaos to the American crews, to the Germans, it was a deadly science. By late 1943, Luftwaffe fighter commanders had turned the destruction of heavy bombers into an art form. Major Walter Dahl of JG 300, one of Germany's celebrated aces, once described it bluntly. "A bomber is not a hunter, it is prey, and prey must be killed quickly." The American combat box formation, 18 to 21 bombers stacked in 3 dimensions, was supposed to be the answer. Each B-17 carried 13 .50 caliber Browning machine guns. Together, a formation could unleash a wall of firepower in every direction. At least, that was the theory. In practice, the Luftwaffe had found the cracks, blind spots in the nose, limited fields of fire on the sides, ammunition that ran out faster than gunners could believe, and, perhaps most importantly, the human element, fear. No matter how tough an aircraft was, no matter how many guns it carried, inside were 19- and 20-year-old boys facing swarms of German fighters screaming in at 400 miles per hour. Heinrich Kocher, commander of 5-Post JG-11, perfected the most dreaded maneuver, the head-on attack. He would dive straight into the formation from 12 o'clock high, close his eyes for a heartbeat, then fire a 2-second burst directly at the cockpit and engines. Before the top turret gunner could even swing around, he was gone. By October 1943, Kocher had destroyed 17 American heavy bombers this way. Other German leaders developed their own methods. Major Günther Golob drilled his men in company front attacks, 8 FW-190s approaching wingtip to wingtip. The American gunners, overwhelmed by too many targets at once, often fired into empty sky while the real killers slipped through. The results were brutal. On August 17, 1943, during the first Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, 60 bombers were shot down, 16% of the attacking force. That alone was devastating. But when the Americans tried again in October, the Luftwaffe did even better. 77 bombers lost or written off, more than 600 airmen killed or captured in a single day. For the Germans, this was vindication. They called it Kanonenfutter, cannon fodder. American bombers, they boasted, were little more than flying steel coffins. And they had another advantage: patience. German fighter units didn't waste fuel chasing bombers across the Channel. They waited deep inside the Reich, right where American escorts had to turn back. Luftwaffe pilots even had a phrase for it: Die goldene Stunde, the golden hour, when the bombers were utterly alone. It seemed like a perfect equation. Bombers plus no escorts equaled massacre. And for a while the numbers proved them right. But the Germans didn't know what was already in motion across the Atlantic. A new fighter was being tested, one with the speed of a Spitfire and the range of a bomber, a machine that could finally follow the flying fortresses all the way to the heart of Germany. That fighter was about to change the math. For the young crews of the 8th Air Force, it wasn't just the flak or the long hours over enemy skies, or even the thought of bailing out into hostile territory. The real terror came from knowing that at some point, their guardians would leave them. The escorts, those little friends as bomber crews called them, simply couldn't go the distance. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, America's main escort fighter in 1943, was a monster of an aircraft. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine roared like a locomotive, and its 850 caliber guns could shred anything in the sky. But it was thirsty. Even with drop tanks, a P-47's combat radius stretched only about 375 miles, enough to get to the German border, not enough to follow the bombers to their real targets. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning looked more promising. Twin engines, long sleek wings, and greater range than the P-47. But the European cold punished the P-38 in ways engineers hadn't foreseen. Engines froze, controls jammed, and the Lightning struggled at high altitude, the very altitude where the flying fortresses flew. So the bombers pressed on without them. The escorts would turn back, fuel gauges dropping toward empty, while the B-17s and B-24s droned deeper into the Reich. At that moment, every man inside those bombers knew what was coming. A waist gunner from the 100th Bomb Group described it years later. The second those fighters banked and headed home, you could feel the tension in the ship. We tightened our formation, we checked our guns, and we waited. We knew they were out there, waiting for us. The Germans were waiting, indeed. They tracked the bomber streams on radar, calculated exactly where the escorts would peel away, and gathered to strike. It was clockwork. American bombers might face 4 hours over enemy territory, but only 90 minutes of that with protection. The rest, they were naked in the sky. German pilots even had a cruel nickname for the moment the escorts vanished. Der Augenblick der Freunde gehen. The instant the friends leave. Some Luftwaffe veterans flew 3 or even 4 sorties against a single raid, landing, refueling, and taking off again, while the same American formation limped toward home. The equation was brutally one-sided. For the bomber crews, this reality left a permanent mark. Many spoke of the sickening twist in the stomach when the escorts tipped their wings and turned back. The loneliness was overwhelming. It wasn't that the Americans lacked courage or determination. It was physics, fuel, weight, and distance had turned into an arithmetic of death. And until that equation changed, every mission into the heart of Germany carried the same grim expectation. Heavy losses. But in secret, across workshops in Britain and factories in California, engineers were working on a solution. A fighter that could go farther, higher, and faster than anything the Germans had ever seen. The Luftwaffe thought the skies belonged to them. They were about to find out otherwise. The irony of history is that America's war-changing fighter didn't begin as an American idea at all. In the spring of 1940, before Pearl Harbor, before the United States was even in the war, a delegation from Britain arrived in California. The Royal Air Force needed more planes. They had been flying Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, but they wanted North American Aviation to build them under license. North American's president, Dutch Kindleberger, wasn't interested in copying an old design. He made a bold offer instead. Give us 120 days, and we'll build you a brand new fighter from scratch, better than the P-40, faster, with longer legs. It sounded like bravado, but his engineers, led by Edgar Schmuid, a German-born designer who had fled Hitler's Reich years earlier, went to work. In just 4 months, they rolled out a sleek new prototype, the NA-73X. On October 26, 1940, test pilot Vance Breeze lifted it off the runway. The Mustang was born. At first, it was a disappointment. The Allison V1710 engine under its nose gave the plane excellent performance at low altitude, perfect for ground attack and reconnaissance. But at 15,000 feet and above, where bombers flew, it gasped for air. German pilots in their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs had nothing to fear from this newcomer. The British, however, saw promise. The airframe was extraordinary. It was smoother, more aerodynamic than even the Spitfire. It handled beautifully at low levels. But to fight in the high skies over Europe, it needed a heart transplant. That solution would come not from California, but from Derby, England. Rolls-Royce engineers took one look at the Mustang and had an idea. What if they swapped its Allison for the same Merlin engine that powered the Spitfire Mark 9? One test flight was enough. Suddenly, the Mustang wasn't just good, it was a revelation. Speed jumped from 390 to over 440 miles per hour. Service ceiling climbed from 31,000 to 42,000 feet. At bomber altitude, the plane that had once wheezed and stalled now danced. The RAF test pilot who flew the first Merlin Mustang said simply, "Gentlemen, this is the plane we've been waiting for." It was a marriage of worlds, American airframe design, British engine brilliance. Neither nation could have built it alone, but together they had just created the machine that would reach Berlin and come back home again. The Luftwaffe still believed in their golden hour. They still believed American bombers would always be left unescorted in the heart of the Reich. They had no idea that the clock was already ticking. War is often decided not just by courage, but by engineering, and sometimes by the simple idea of putting the right heart into the right body. In April 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker strapped into a Mustang powered by its original Allison engine. He liked the airframe immediately, sleek, stable, faster at low altitude than anything the RAF had flown. But when he pushed it higher, he felt the weakness. Above 15,000 feet, the Mustang lost its breath. When he landed, Harker told his colleagues, "The airframe is superb. What it needs is a Merlin." The suggestion was almost casual, but it would change the course of the war. Within months, engineers had bolted the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 into a Mustang. The effect was staggering. Where the Allison had wheezed, the Merlin roared. Maximum speed leapt from 390 to 440 miles per hour. The service ceiling rose by 11,000 feet. At 20,000 feet, the altitude where B-17s and B-24s lived, the Mustang was suddenly not just capable, but dominant. Even more impressive was how it handled. Test pilots described it as if someone had taken the best qualities of the Spitfire and the P-40 and blended them into a single machine. Smooth in a climb, steady in a dive, responsive in turns, and with the endurance to keep going long after its rivals had turned back. The Mustang had become something new, something the Luftwaffe had not faced before. A fighter that could outclimb, outrun, and outlast. The marriage of American mass production with British engineering brilliance created a synergy neither country could have achieved alone. America could build thousands. Britain had given it the beating heart it needed. By late 1943, the first Merlin-powered Mustangs, designated the P-51B, were rolling off production lines. To most German pilots watching contrails from their cockpits, the silhouettes still looked unfamiliar. They mistook them for P-47 Thunderbolts, assuming they'd turn back as usual. But these planes weren't turning back. They kept flying deeper, beyond the golden hour, all the way to the heart of Germany. For the first time, American bombers had an escort that could stay with them from takeoff to target and all the way home again. The math of air combat had just been rewritten. A fighter is only as powerful as far as its tanks will take it. The Germans knew this. For years, their strategy rested on a cruel calculation. The Americans might reach Germany, but their escorts never could. The P-47 Thunderbolt could fight like a bulldog, but it guzzled fuel. The P-38 Lightning had twin engines for range, but those engines froze in the thin European air. No matter how many fighters America sent up, their wings always turned home before the bombers reached the real danger zones. That was the golden moment the Luftwaffe counted on. The P-51 Mustang shattered that arithmetic. Its secret wasn't just the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. It was the way North American engineers had built the Mustang's airframe. Its laminar flow wing was smooth as glass, cutting drag by nearly 30%. At cruising speed, the Mustang sipped just 65 gallons an hour. Compare that to the Thunderbolt's 100 gallons at the same speed. That difference meant time. Time in the air. Time over Germany. Time that bombers had never had before. And then came the drop tanks. At first, 75-gallon external tanks were slung under the wings. In early 1944, 108-gallon tanks became standard. With them, the Mustang's combat radius stretched to 850 miles, farther than any single-engine fighter in the world. That was enough to take off from England, escort bombers to Berlin, fight over the target, and still have fuel to make it home. Imagine being a German pilot, climbing into your Messerschmitt in January 1944. You're told the Americans are coming again. You know the routine: wait for the escorts to peel off, then pounce on the helpless bombers. But when you dive in, something's different. Sleek new fighters slide out of formation, not leaving the bombers, but guarding them. And they're still there, miles deeper into the Reich than any American fighter has ever been before. It was a shock that rippled through the Luftwaffe. Pilots who had laughed at the flying fortresses now faced a grim, new reality. The little friends were no longer leaving. One veteran recalled in disbelief, "We thought they were Thunderbolts at first, but they never turned back. And when we attacked, they attacked us." Suddenly, the hunters had become the hunted. The Mustang had erased the Luftwaffe's greatest advantage. The skies over Germany were no longer safe. The first Merlin-powered Mustangs reached England in November 1943. They were assigned to the 354th Fighter Group, nicknamed the Pioneer Mustang Group. At first, even the Americans weren't sure what to make of their new mounts. Transitioning from the heavy, rugged Thunderbolt to the sleek Mustang was like stepping out of a truck and into a sports car. Lieutenant Colonel Glenn Duncan, one of the first to fly it, later recalled, "The moment I lifted off, I knew we had something special. It was smooth, it was quick, and it could fly forever." The Mustang's combat debut came quietly. On December 1, 1943, 16 P-51Bs swept across Belgium. They didn't see enemy fighters, but the test was successful. 4 days later, on December 5th, they flew their first bomber escort. Short range, simple mission. Again, no major contact. But then came December 13, 1943, the first long-range escort mission to Kiel, nearly 500 miles from base. No Allied single-engine fighter had ever flown that deep before. German pilots, waiting for their usual golden moment, were stunned when Mustangs kept flying past the point where Thunderbolts always turned back. For the American bomber crews, the difference was immediate. After months of bracing for the sickening loneliness when their escorts departed, suddenly the Mustangs stayed with them. Tail gunners radioed to each other in disbelief. "The little friends are still here." That winter, the Mustang began making its presence felt in German skies. On December 20th, escorting a raid on Bremen, Mustangs downed 3 Luftwaffe fighters without losing a single bomber. To the Germans, the psychological impact was devastating. They mistook the Mustangs for Thunderbolts at first, waiting for them to leave. But when they didn't, panic set in. One Luftwaffe pilot's radio call, intercepted by Allied monitors, summed it up. They are not turning back. They are still coming. The hunters had become the hunted. For the first time, American bombers had true guardians, fighters that could fight all the way to the target and all the way back home. The tide of the air war was beginning to turn, though no one yet realized just how completely the Mustang would change everything. For years, German fighter pilots had enjoyed a grim certainty. They knew the routine, the timing, the weaknesses. They waited for the escorts to turn back, then they closed in, tearing American bomber formations apart. To them, the bombers were targets, not threats. But in late 1943 and early 1944, that certainty began to crumble. At first, many Luftwaffe pilots didn't realize what they were facing. From a distance, the Mustang's long nose and wide canopy resembled a P-47 Thunderbolt. They assumed these fighters would soon peel away as always. But then the Mustangs kept coming, past the German border, past Bremen, past Hamburg, even circling Berlin. The disbelief was captured in intercepted German radio calls. One pilot shouted, "Das ist unmöglich! They are still here!" Another voice cut in, "Nein, it's a new type. They do not turn back." The effect on morale was immediate. Major Walter Dahl, one of Germany's top aces, later admitted, "We had built our tactics around the escorts leaving." Without that moment, our entire system collapsed. German formations that once swarmed confidently into the bombers now hesitated. The hunters found themselves under attack from above, Mustangs diving like hawks onto their flanks. The very idea that bombers would be protected all the way to the target and home again was unthinkable just months earlier. For the American crews, it was a revelation. A waist gunner from the 390th Bomb Group recalled the first time Mustangs stayed with them all the way. "We cried in the intercom. After all the missions we'd flown alone, to look out and still see fighters with us. It was like hope had finally arrived in the sky." And for the Luftwaffe, it was despair. By early 1944, pilots who had once mocked American bombers as flying coffins now whispered another truth. The Americans had built a fighter that could not only match them, but outlast them. The balance of power in the air was shifting. The laughter had stopped. The Mustang wasn't just another fighter. It was a revelation, but a weapon is only as powerful as the men who wield it. And in the winter of 1943 to 44, American pilots were just beginning to understand what they had. Lieutenant Colonel Glenn E. Saunders Duncan, who would become one of the Mustang's most famous commanders, described his first combat mission in the P-51B. "I realized almost immediately this was no Thunderbolt, no Lightning. This was something else. It could turn with them, climb with them, dive past them, and still have fuel in the tanks when the fight was over." The Mustang allowed pilots to fight on their own terms. The Thunderbolt had been a bruiser, deadly in a dive, but clumsy in a turn. The Lightning had been versatile, but fragile at altitude. The Mustang was different. It combined grace with endurance. Pilots quickly learned that they didn't have to run or climb away from a Messerschmitt 109 or a Focke-Wulf 190. They could meet them head-on and win. A young pilot from the 357th Fighter Group remembered the first time he realized what the Mustang could do. "I rolled in on a pair of 109s. Normally I'd break off after a few seconds. I'd be out of speed or out of gas, but the Mustang just kept going. It felt like strapping wings to a race car. I tore right through them and still had the power to climb again." The Mustang gave the Americans freedom. They no longer had to stick close to the bombers like chained dogs. With the Mustang's range and speed, commanders gave a new order: free hunt. Squadrons were unleashed ahead of the bomber streams, sweeping German airfields, ambushing climbing fighters, and cutting off attacks before they ever reached the formation. For the Luftwaffe, this was devastating. Aces who once dove confidently into bomber boxes now found themselves bounced from above by Mustangs they hadn't even seen. The air that had once been their hunting ground had turned into a trap. And the numbers began to tell the story. In January 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 238 bombers. By March, with Mustangs flying deep escort, the losses fell by half. Even as the bombing campaign intensified, the Mustangs weren't just protecting, they were killing. One German pilot later admitted, "It was not the bombers that broke us, it was the fighters. They hunted us until there was nowhere left to run." For American pilots, the discovery was intoxicating. They had been handed the finest fighter of the war, and they knew it. March 6, 1944. Dawn broke grey over the English countryside as 730 B-17s and B-24s rumbled down runways. Their target was Berlin itself, the heart of Hitler's Reich. It was the mission the Luftwaffe had always sworn would be suicide for the Americans. But this time, something was different. Riding above and alongside the bomber stream were sleek, long-nosed fighters with red and blue checkerboard tails. They weren't thunderbolts. They weren't lightnings. They were P-51 Mustangs, and they weren't turning back. For the bomber crews, the sight was almost unbelievable. A tail gunner from the 95th Bomb Group recalled, "We kept waiting for the escorts to wave goodbye, but mile after mile they were still there, over the channel, over the Rhine, over the target. For the first time, we weren't alone." The Luftwaffe threw everything it had at the raid. Nearly 600 fighters rose to meet the bombers. Among them were some of Germany's most experienced aces, men who had survived years of combat on every front. They expected another turkey shoot. Instead, they flew straight into a storm. Mustangs slashed through their formations, diving from high altitude, climbing back, and diving again. The German pilots, used to dictating the terms of battle, suddenly found themselves on the defensive. One Mustang pilot, Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group, scored 3 kills that day, earning his squadron the nickname the Debden Eagles. Others reported chasing Messerschmitts right back to their airfields, strafing them as they tried to land. By the end of the day, the Americans had lost 69 bombers, a heavy price, but far less than the Luftwaffe expected. In exchange, German fighter losses reached staggering levels. Dozens of their most experienced pilots never returned. The message was clear: not even Berlin was safe anymore. German civilians who had once watched American bombers pass overhead with a grim sort of acceptance now saw a new sight. Fighters escorting them, shooting down Luftwaffe planes in the skies above their capital. It was a psychological blow as much as a military one. Adolf Galland, the famed German ace, later admitted that March 1944 was the breaking point. The Mustang was the best all-around fighter of the war. It could fly for hours, fight at any altitude, and it was built in numbers we could not match. We could replace aircraft. We could not replace the men. The battle over Berlin marked more than just a raid. It was the moment the Luftwaffe's back was broken. From then on, every mission deeper into Germany became less a gamble and more a certainty. The skies belonged at last to the Americans. Wars are not won by machines alone, but by the ability to build them faster than the enemy can destroy them. The P-51 Mustang was not only a superb fighter, it was the product of an industrial miracle. In 1940, before the war, America's aircraft industry was modest. By 1944, it was a giant. At the peak of production, 15,000 Mustangs rolled out of factories in Texas, California, and Michigan. That meant nearly 500 new fighters every single month. At North American's Inglewood plant in California, young women, many barely out of high school, riveted wings together in shifts that ran around the clock. At the Dallas plant, Rosie the Riveter's real-life sisters wired cockpits and mounted machine guns. At Packard's engine factory in Detroit, workers turned out thousands of Rolls-Royce Merlin engines under license, each one a hand-built marvel of precision. For the men flying over Europe, it was hard to comprehend. A Mustang lost in combat could be replaced in days. For the Luftwaffe, every plane lost was a crisis, every veteran pilot irreplaceable. The contrast was staggering. In 1944 alone, America built 96,000 aircraft. Germany built fewer than 40,000. And while German factories struggled under Allied bombing, American plants worked under bright lights powered by endless electricity, fed by rails and rivers of raw material. One German prisoner of war later confessed his shock when he toured a U.S. aircraft factory after the war. "We thought American planes were mass-produced junk, but I saw the precision, the organization, the thousands of workers moving like a machine. I understood then why we lost." It wasn't just numbers, it was systems. Each Mustang was assembled from parts made in dozens of states. Wings built in California matched fuselages from Texas, bolted together with engines from Detroit and instruments from Ohio. It was democracy turned into hardware. By mid-1944, Allied commanders could call for hundreds of new fighters in a single month. And get them. The Luftwaffe had no answer. The Mustang was more than a fighter. It was the embodiment of American industry unleashed, the arsenal of democracy given wings. Back in October 1943, German pilots laughed as B-17s and B-24s lumbered across their skies. They called them flying coffins, sure they would burn before reaching their targets. And for a time, they were right. But by the summer of 1944, the skies over Europe told a different story. Mustangs now ranged from England to Berlin, from the Ardennes to the Baltic, from Normandy's beaches to the very gates of Vienna. Everywhere the Luftwaffe rose, the Mustang was waiting. The proud German aces who had once hunted with confidence were now fighting for survival. They faced swarms of Mustangs flown by young American pilots with more fuel, more firepower, and the advantage of numbers their industry could never match. Walter Dahl, one of Germany's most decorated fighter leaders, later admitted, "We were no longer the hunters. We were the hunted. It was hopeless." By late 1944, entire bomber formations returned from raids untouched, a miracle compared to the bloodbaths of a year earlier. American crews who once prayed just to make it home now sang over the intercom when they saw the silhouettes of their little friends sliding into formation beside them. The Luftwaffe was broken, not just in numbers, but in spirit, and so the laughter stopped. The P-51 Mustang had rewritten the air war. It wasn't just a fighter, it was a symbol of what free nations could achieve when engineers, workers, and pilots all pulled together. A plane born of Anglo-American cooperation, built in thousands by democratic industry, flown by kids from Oklahoma, New York, and Iowa who wanted to get the job done and go home. One bomber crewman said it best after watching Mustangs tear into a wave of German fighters over the Ruhr. "That was the day I knew we were going to win the war." The Germans had laughed once, but the Mustang had the last word. What do you think about the Mustang's role in changing the air war? Did you have a family member who flew in Europe or stories passed down from that time? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. We've got many more untold World War II tales ahead, stories of courage, innovation, and moments that changed history forever. Stick around, because the next one might just surprise you.